So now that we've talked about muscles and what they do, let's talk about the three different types of muscles. We learned them for our first exam, but now let's talk about how they're a little different from each other. So cardiac muscle, it's found in the heart. Its function is to pump blood, and that's the only place you see cardiac muscle. Cardiac always means heart. So when we get to Bio 202, when we're talking about cardiac regions, we're always going to be talking about regions close to the heart. The characteristics is that this muscle is resistant to fatigue. Can you imagine if your heart got tired? That would be a problem. It contains these ability to do rhythmic sort of beating, and that's going to become from, you'll learn about this later, called an SA node and a pacemaker node, and they'll basically be able to transfer electrical energy from one area all the way through the heart to basically make it beat and contract at the same time. So almost like those rowers that you see for competitive rowing. There's one guy at the end and he goes row, 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 and basically that's that electrical energy that tells the heart to do what it needs to do. It's involuntary, so that means you don't have to think about your heart pumping. Can you imagine if you were at rest, in a minute it has to pump 60 to 80 times, so every time you'd have to think, beat, beat, beat. That would be difficult. And long contractions are effectively moving heart liquid, so which is going to be blood. Cardiac muscles are going to be very short. They're connected to each other through these things called desmosomes, and that makes it so the muscle can't rip apart from each other. They have little gap junctions to allow fibers to communicate, so they can communicate and sort of adjust to what they need to do. So if electricity is coming this way, they know to beat this way. If electricity is coming this way, they know to beat this way. Because it's really, the heart is basically a two-chambered structure, but each one of the chambers could be broken up into another two chambers, and electrical energy tells the heart what to do. So in essence, does it bring it into one chamber and then sort of push it to the lungs? Does it bring into another chamber and then push it through all the way to your head, to your toes? We're going to learn way more about that in nauseam. That's basically going to be one big chapter that we cover in 202. But that is all done by the pacemaker node, and it's just electrical energy, and it tells the heart what to do and how to do it. So the cardiac muscle uses aerobic respiration and is resistant to fatigue. A lot of myoglobins and glycogen is there. Why? And then the last one, let's just ask you these questions and we'll kind of knock them through. Lots of mitochondria. Do you think it has lots of mitochondria? And do you think it's vulnerable to interruptions of oxygen supply? Well, first, contains a lot of myoglobin and glycogen. Myoglobin is the thing that holds oxygen together, and glycogen holds a bunch of sugar. So if we didn't have a lot of myoglobin and glycogen in the heart would get fatigued, it might not get oxygen enough, so they need to have the biggest stockpile of oxygen and the biggest stockpile of glucose, so that way we can keep beating. Everything else is just a luxury. If your arm doesn't get a little bit of glucose or oxygen for a little while, you're going to have lactic acid, it's going to fatigue, and that's it. Your heart fatigues, you're dead. Lots of mitochondria, you bet your sweet pippy it does. If it didn't have mitochondria, it couldn't produce a ton of ATP. And that ATP is the thing that keeps those myosin fibers, the thin and thick filament, from going and moving. And if we're talking about a muscle that moves 60 to 80 times a minute at rest, of course that's going to need a lot of ATP, which really comes from mitochondria. And is it vulnerable to interruptions of oxygen supply? It is, but because it has the myoglobin there, it has a little stockpile of oxygen that it can keep. So again, it doesn't really care if your legs or your arms don't get some muscle. It really does need to get to your heart. Smooth muscle is stimulated by the heart as well. With Cardiac and smooth, we're going to get into crazy detail in our first unit of 202, so that's why I'm being kind of skimpy with these two. But basically what happens is there are some stimuli that make smooth muscle change, and keep in mind, smooth muscle is really in your arteries, your veins, your small intestines, and it basically makes it so they will push blood in one direction or maybe inhibit blood from going to one place temporarily to give it to other muscles. And for your stomach, your small intestines are moving all the time. The only times they stop moving is basically when you're active. When you're sitting, sleeping, doing something inactive, your small intestines are moving like crazy. If you had a little window to see what they were doing, they would be just constantly churning and moving and moving. So, I think I already said this. Smooth muscles are found in the urinary bladder, stomach, intestines, uterus, and they do this thing called peristalsis, which is basically where they'll go ahead and contract to move things in one direction. Also, the cool thing is that they do, by squeezing this way, they're making sure that whatever item only goes in one direction and that's it. Can you imagine if peristalsis didn't work that way? You'd basically be eating and then eventually it would churn back up and come out. Oh, that would be terrible. Cows can control this a little more because they have multiple stomachs, and that's why they will have cud, which is chewed food, and they'll basically go ahead and churn it all, break it down as much as they can, spit it back up into their mouth, and have it go through again. They also have different chambers of their stomach because grass is so hard to break down. Please don't remember any of that for the exam. It was just more gee whiz stuff. Smooth muscle is definitely not striated. Those myofilaments and the actins and the myosins attach to dense bodies, and basically they're going to help with that peristalsis process. That sarcoplasmic reticulum is rare, and there's really no T-tubules here, so the calcium is concentrated and comes from extracellular fluid. So there's going to be an extracellular source where the calcium comes in to help them contract and do everything that they need to do. And then, of course, here's our review, because we've mostly been covering skeletal muscle, and that's why we just had a couple of slides for smooth muscle and for cardiac. Cardiac and smooth we'll talk way more about in 202, so there's really no point going into tons of material here.